useful ideas and suggestions for guests and topics.
Great events, programs, and
All the countries are useful.
Hello and welcome to this week's segment of Dialogue Houston. I'm your host, Lawrence Payne. To our regular viewing audience, welcome. To those joining us perhaps for the first time here for ACC's TV Dialogue Houston, we can be found now every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 a.m. and again at 6 p.m. and on Saturday afternoons at 3 p.m. As always, at the top of the hour, let me thank you for your thoughtful calls, emails, and text messages concerning shows that we've aired here on ACC TV, but more importantly, your great ideas for topics and guests and subjects to be covered on upcoming segments of Dialogue Houston. For after all, this is your community affairs, public affairs show here on ACC TV, proudly in its 29th season, and we're celebrating our 30th anniversary in January, and we'll be talking about that a little later. I have so wanted to have our guest that we have on today because the subject matter we're going to discuss is civility, or the lack thereof, or incivility. In a time and place where we need it more than ever, to be able to have the honest conversation and dialogue with each other, to begin to understand compromise and negotiations, and how important it is to do these in a way that protects the human dignity of every human being, lifts up the human dignity of every human being. To do that, I know of no other individuals better suited for this than the co-founders of the Institute for Civility, Cassandra Dahnke and Tomas Spath. Welcome, Cassandra and Tomas.
Thank you so much for having us, Larry. We really appreciate it. And any time is a good time to talk about civility.
Well, let's just go ahead, Tomas.
Well, thank you so much. We were asked early on in our adventure here, what do we mean by civility? So I thought I'd offer our definitions just so that everybody understands.
Let's get it out. Let's get it out up front.
And it took us 2 months to figure out what we meant by civility, which is claiming and caring for one's identity, needs, and beliefs without degrading somebody else's in the process. So it's been a great adventure over 20 years in teaching people that we all value and that we all need to be a part of this governing process.
Let's just start with the definition itself. That contains a lot within that. That's a hard thing for some people to do. Just those simple but yet profound words in that definition seems to be something we should do with just because we're human beings in relationship to other human beings. But it's easier said than done, is it not?
It is easier said than done because what we're saying is that it's not about just going along to get along. We do include that you need to claim and care for who you are, even as you don't degrade others for who they are. And that can be a challenge sometimes.
Yes, because in our relationship, I have found that there are some activities that I have done that offended her, and I never knew it was offensive. Yet, so it's really difficult to claim and be who you are and do it in a way that doesn't degrade somebody else.
You know, it really starts with the quality of the relationship, does it not? Developing that relationship built on mutual trust and respect, and really nurturing that and continuing to grow that, because it seems to me that's the cornerstone.
Well, it is. It's a willingness to show up and to stay present. And that takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of practice, and it takes a lot of discipline, a real commitment to want to be civil. Because it's always easy to just walk away or give up. But we're saying that that's not helpful all the time. You need to find ways to continue to build understanding between one another.
And the times when we reach a disagreement, then we encourage people to wonder why it is that the other person thinks or believes in a different way. And that enriches one's own life when you reach out that way to learn from the other.
Well, since we don't live on an island by ourselves, since we're always going to be surrounded by other human beings different than myself, we need to build the ability to do that, reach out and understand that not to do that is very selfish. And even though we know we're born selfish, we have to work on being selfless. That the ability to achieve that, though, in a world as diverse with the biggest D that you can think about diversity is not optional, because you're going to have to figure out a way to get along with each other, to compromise and negotiate, to figure out what the general greater good is for all. Does it not seem that way?
Right.
Right, but we all have different ideas about what's best for everyone, and that's where the challenge comes up.
That's why we elect our elected officials and send them to Washington so that they can figure this all out for all of us.
But we're all entitled to our own opinion, perspective, and viewpoint. We're not entitled to our own fact, though.
That's correct.
And I think if we when we get out there talking about this is my personal opinion, perspective, and viewpoint, and I understand how you have come to that. I understand based on your experience, this is what has led you to say what you just said. But let me share with you my experience, tell you my story that may be different from yours based upon my life experience and my reality. That's where the communication and dialogue takes place, does it not?
Well, that's where it gets rich and deep and challenging too, because within any group, life experiences are so different. In fact, just within a shared experience, we will all come out with different perspectives, different understandings. It's very interesting. A very simple example of this is if there's a crime scene or an incident and police go and ask all the witnesses, what did you see? And they'll hear different things from different people because we all pick up on different things. And so it happens in everyday life, and over time it shapes us and who we are and what we believe and how we perceive things. One of the things we teach is what you believe influences what you see, and what you see influences what you do. And so you really have to sometimes dig below the surface of disagreement to find out what's driving that, and the belief systems and how we come to hold those different belief systems, whether around anything, whether it's political or religious or regarding food or whatever it is, where the best place to live is. I mean, we all have different perspectives.
There's a great cartoon that's out there in the world, and it has two individuals. They're both looking at the ground, and on the ground, there's a number 9 looking at from one side, and on the other side, it looks perfectly like a number 6. Mm-hmm. So you can have two individuals. They're both right when they see that number, but they don't see the same thing. And so we all need to be open to the idea that, others will see something differently. And that's what enriches life. And that's would enrich our democracy. Mm-hmm. If our elected officials would open up to the ideas of everybody, because that's what they got to do.
But that goes against, I agree with you, that's the way it should be, but it goes against human nature. Because we have not adopted that different is different. I always add these two words, different is different, amen, period. Not better than, not more than, not less than, just different. Because we are all different human beings. And our daily lived experiential realities shape, as you said, who we are, how we think, how we see the world, how we experience the other. And because that is so deeply seated in the culture of our being, the essence of our human beingness, socially, economically, politically, and spiritually, I do damage when I attack that other human being's sense of who they are, as wrong or right as I may think they are. I can't do the injustice of attacking that spirit. I have to fall back and try to do what I was taught all my life, as many of us have been taught, to give that person unconditional love, even in the midst of this disagreement.
Well, that sounds good, but it's hard to do.
Yes, it's hard to do. Of course, it's hard to do.
especially if somebody's right in your face or very antagonistic, it can be extremely difficult, and it takes us out of our comfort zones. So again, it takes a real commitment to maintain civility. You have to be willing to work for it. And I believe that the part of the reason it's become such an issue in recent decades is because civility is one of those threads in the fabric of society that you don't really miss it until it's gone.
Yeah.
And so then once it disappears or becomes very frayed, we say all of a sudden, well, what happened? Where did that go? But it's one of those elements of society we can't take for granted. We constantly have to teach, we have to practice, we have to remind, and we have to hold up the value of what comes out of maintaining civility, because sometimes it just seems like too much darn work. And so
do we teach civility anymore?
We do. We teach civility to all kinds of people, all kinds of groups. We work with schools, with businesses, with faith communities, with elected leaders. Our civility training has proven to be really helpful to people, to give them the skills they need to do all this that we're talking about.
One of the things that also happens in our society is that we live in a society where everybody expects everything to happen right now, right away. And when we come with this expectation that we can change that other person's perspective or thought, we're going up a wrong ladder. And so we need to understand that things take time, and so it's really important to know that it's a journey. It's not something that you're going to get done right away.
Well, the story, yes, is all about the stories. I think telling our stories, the stories along the journey which inform us. The stories along the journey. The famous phrase: "You change the story, you change the narrative, you change the outcome."
Amen.
And so I think it's part of that, civility, we've said, is polite, reasonable, respectful dialogue and behavior. It's a disagreeing without being disagreeable. It's seeking common ground. All that sounds wonderful, but as we both said it, and all of us have said, it's very hard to do. I grew up in Orange, Texas with the Ku Klux Klan. Trying to have civility and trying to be respectful to each other was a daily challenge, literally a daily challenge.
Yes.
But what I learned is that I had to really take a step back and realize I am never going to change this person's perspective, opinion, or viewpoint. I'm not here to persuade or dissuade them. I'm here to try to figure out some little kernel, some little nugget that we can agree on for common ground. Because this is what I've learned over my lifetime, that since racism is a commitment to ignorance, racism is an emotional commitment to ignorance. I'm not going to change that person. But within that definition, there is something we still can find that we can agree on. It may not be much. It may be a narrow sliver, a window, but I have to try to seek that. If not, the alternative is just what? Constant battle, fighting, disagreement, all out war in some cases that we've seen in this country. Yeah. So back to both your point earlier, civility seems to me not to be an option. It can't be an option in our society, or there will have no society, no democracy, no government.
Well, in fact, that's what got us started on this journey back in the 1990s, because we were taking groups of people to DC, and when they found out they disagreed on issues, they didn't get angry and they didn't get ugly about it. They just shut down because they didn't know how to talk through those differences and in the midst of those differences. And so one of the things we focus on is, folks, if we can't at least talk with one another in a respectful way, even when we disagree, we're not going to be able to do much of anything else. Civility is a fundamental element of a civilized, and then that repeats the word, a civilized society. It's foundational to democracy and to who we aspire to be as a nation. Without it, you're right, it all falls apart.
How do we get to those power sharing agreements? How do we talk about promoting bipartisanism? How do we talk about collaborative policy making? Because right now it seems that is almost impossible. We're entrenched in our own camps. We play to our audiences. We don't really care to hear or listen, forget even understanding the other side. We are just so locked into what we think is right because we're playing to our base. We may know in our hearts of heart that it's not right, but we're so locked into the changing demographics of society that I must hold on to what I have at all costs, because that day is slowly slipping away, particularly in the case of the white male, where that authority and power will be vested only in that person.
Well, there's a lot of what you're saying is true, but there are so many pieces to this puzzle. And one piece is the media and what they choose to portray. There's actually a deep hunger within this country for civility, both among people in general and among elected officials. But you don't hear about that. You don't see that except anecdotally when you're speaking with your neighbor or having a conversation like this. But when we started back in '98, when we launched the Institute, we were the only organization working on a national basis on civility. Mm-hmm. That's why we got started, because nobody was doing it. Now there are so many organizations that have sprouted up, and there's a civility movement building within the country because people are starving for civility. They're really hungry for it. You don't hear about that in the media. You don't see that in the headlines because confrontation sells.
Weber Shandwick is an organization that has done a survey on civility every single year. And every single year, it comes back with a report that 78% of the United States citizens would like to have more civility present in our society. And sometimes it gets up into the 80s. And it's been that way since 1998 up to now and up to the present. So we need a social movement, a huge movement of people that elevate the conversation that we're having in our communities and in our states and in our federal government. Most members of Congress that we know wish to have more civility, but they have to play to their people, to their bases. And so when they do that, you know, their job is to get elected. It's not to represent the people. They need to get reelected. That's the real job of a politician. And so they play to their base. We as a community, we need a strong voice for civility. And that's why we started this organization. And we're so happy now that we're not alone. There's thousands of organizations throughout our country. And when I did a search for civility in government in 1998, Dr. Google found one website. So go and look today, and you will find millions of websites, millions of pages on civility in government. So we're growing.
But you know, it's not just civility in government, it's civility among human beings, period. You know, we attend all these meetings now of school boards, of social neighborhood gatherings and groups, and they're so divided. They not only care to not hear, let alone listen and understand the other person. They are just so convinced and convicted that they are right and everyone else is wrong.
Right.
And therefore, do not try to cloud me with logic or reason or facts or data, because I'm not going to believe it anyway. It's all false. You made it up. So we're just in this seemingly locked in position, entrenched positions.
Yes, and one of the qualities necessary for a true civility is empathy. And empathy is something that has to be taught and nurtured. It's not something that people just have naturally, I don't believe, or not many people do. And so it gets back to good old-fashioned parenting. You know, everything I ever needed to know, I learned in kindergarten, the good old Robert Fulghum book from years ago. And so it starts with each of us, and that can be frustrating to hear. There's not a magic wand. There's not a magic pill that you can give somebody to make them civil or to keep yourself civil if you've had a bad day. But it's something that each of us has to work on. Years ago, I went to a town hall meeting, and you mentioned school board meetings or neighborhood meetings, and those are all a form of government too. Any place where people are gathering to try to work out problems together.
Right.
Those are forms of government. And so we're not just talking about the Capitol or the president or the legislators.
No.
We're talking about everyday life and just trying to make it work. But years ago, back in the 1990s, I went to a town hall meeting that Congressman Bill Archer had at the time on the west side of town, right after he had become chair of the Ways and Means Committee. And it was a very well-attended meeting. There were at least 500 people there, maybe more. And early on in the meeting, a woman stood up, and she was so angry because he had gone and talked to the president, who was then Bill Clinton, about the budget. And the Republicans had just come into majority. Why was he bothering to talk to Democrat president? Finally, the Republicans were going to have their day, and it was time for the Democrats to sit back and get out of the way. And she went on and was so convicted, as you say, of the righteousness of her position. So finally, she sat down, and Representative Archer, basically explained the budget process and why it was important for him to speak with the president and have a meeting of the minds. Shortly after that, another woman stood up on the other side of the room, and she was just shaking all over, whether because she was nervous or she was angry, I do not know. But she said, "Excuse me, I thought this was a town hall meeting and not a Republican rally." She said, I'm a Democrat, and that woman has just called me every name in the book, and I am highly offended. And she sat down, and Representative Archer assured her that it was a town hall meeting and that it was important for everybody to participate and be heard. A short time later, the second woman, the Democrat, stood up and left the room. And everyone saw her, and about a dozen people broke out like this.
The door hits you on the way out.
Rude comments, and which I won't repeat here. And my heart just sank because I thought I was in a room of adults, and I expected people to behave in a more civil way. So I sat there alone in my thoughts as the meeting continued. And toward the end, I raised my hand, and Bill Archer called on me. And I said, I come to all your town hall meetings just to listen. I said, I've never said a word, but I can't let this one go by. I think for everyone who's angry at you for reaching out and talking to people who have different beliefs than you, reaching out across the aisle and discussing problems, for everyone who's angry with you about that, I believe most of us are just glad that you're focused on the problem and trying to find a solution. Now, when I said that, I had no idea what the response was going to be. The last thing I had heard were all the rude comments as the woman had left. And for all I knew, I was going to be run out of the meeting on a rail. But what happened instead was there was a spontaneous burst of applause. Presumably everybody in the room, minus the 12 or so who had clapped when the other woman had left, who just applauded my plea for civility, for bipartisanship, for just focusing on the problem rather than hating each other. And what happened is in that burst of applause, the whole atmosphere in the room changed and we all got a different message. Had I not spoken up, everyone would have left thinking that everyone in the room felt like the 12 who had been ugly about it. But instead, everyone left uplifted, knowing that they weren't the only ones who cared about civility. So it's that isolation of not knowing if anybody else cares. It's the essential, that's part of why we organize, so you're part of a large whole.
Let me ask this question in the little time we have left, and need probably a fairly quick response. Can we have both honesty and truth and civility at the same time?
Absolutely. You can't have one without the other.
I think we as a country need to expect that.
Well, the critical race theory discussion, conversation, debate that's going on now will test that point that we just raised. Because it is based on truth, it is based on fact, it is based on history. People are caring not to want to know the truth and the facts and the history, to disregard it, or in many cases to rewrite it. Right. And so we'll see how this plays out in the next months and years as we go forward. It's not going away. We've adopted it now as a political wedge, so it will be with us for a long time. And we'll see how civility can help the situation, perhaps bring us together and not tear us apart any more than we already are. Cassandra and Tomas, quickly, just 2 seconds, wrap up, and we have to go. Go ahead. I saw you wanted to say something.
Our prayer is that we all stay present with each other as we grow and learn together.
Thank you for having us, Larry. It's always going to be a few step forwards, a few step back. Just continue the journey and hang in there.
Yes, it is. Thank you very much, as always, for being with us, and we'll be in conversation some more. Let me close with these closing thoughts real quick. Is it possible to have the challenging social justice dialogues we need to have today with both civility and honesty and boldness? It is not only possible, but necessary for us to both bridge the differences that divide us and form the kind of competitive and comparative relationships necessary to deal with the social justice challenges that now confront all of us. Dialogue is communication that approaches and promotes a confirmation of the other. Dialogue enables people with different viewpoints to form relationships across the differences that divide us. Dialogue requires speaking with respect and listening for understanding. Civility is the foundation of civilization. Without it, we are doomed. Without it, as a people, we will perish. And so in this world of systematic racism, polarization, pandemic, climate change, inequality, and the list goes on, civility, communication, and dialogue is what will get us out of this. We will continue this discussion and dialogue in weeks to come about these issues and related issues, so please join us here on Dialogue Houston. As always, until we come together again, stay well, be safe, peace, power, and love.